Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I am so excited to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Carrie James, Emily Weinstein, and Merv Lapus. FAN is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year, and we are honored to have the robust support of dozens of schools, nonprofits, corporations, families, and individuals from across the country. We are deeply committed to our vision of an informed and compassionate community, and will achieve that vision by presenting fresh ideas that elevate minds, expand hearts, and make the world a better place. We have hundreds of videos of past events archived on our YouTube channel, so please be sure to subscribe and get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions, let's get going. Dr. Carrie James is a sociologist and longtime researcher of young people's experiences. Emphasizing qualitative methods, her work explores opportunities and dilemmas of digital life for adolescents' well-being, social lives, and civic participation. Dr. James is a principal investigator and senior research associate at Project Zero at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and the author of Disconnected: Youth, New Media, and the Ethics Gap. She appeared for FAN on that topic in 2015. We're glad to have her back. Dr. Emily Weinstein is a social scientist who has spent over a decade researching the ways today's technologies are shaping and reshaping adolescent lives. Dr. Weinstein is a principal investigator of Project Zero, and she and Dr. James lead a suite of projects about digital dilemmas and digital well-being. She is also a longtime collaborator of Common Sense Media, translating research insights for their award-winning digital citizenship curriculum. Merv Lapus is a vice president of education, outreach, and engagement at Common Sense Media, responsible for the outreach and engagement strategy for Common Sense Education, and he oversees a team impacting school communities using technology to help students thrive in a digital world. Collaborating with school networks, state-level organizations, community leaders, and national partners, he is committed to fostering a whole community approach to digital well-being and establishing supportive learning spaces for all children and families to thrive in a world with media and technology. And now let's welcome Carrie, Emily, and Merv.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Wow.
Thank you, Lonnie. That was wonderful. It's great to be back, even if it's virtual.
Yeah, and Carrie and Emily, we've come a long way. I've worked with you all for some time now, and I must say I've read a lot of your great resources. It's actually helped me a lot in my work at Common Sense. But today, and Carrie, you had a book before. Today, we're talking about books, and there's this great book that you guys have created that's out there. I know I've read through it. It's been really important, but I will say there's a big, spectrum of other literature out there that isn't teens and tech. So I'm really curious, like through your own words, like what makes this book so unique and so different for those families and those parents that are out there that are really looking for some answers, right? Teens and tech, so much to choose from. What makes this book stand out?
Thanks, Merv, and thanks everyone for being with us tonight. So I'm Emily. I'm a psychologist by training. Carrie's a sociologist. We have spent over a decade doing research on teens and technology. And part of why we are so excited about this book is we just had an amazing opportunity to work on a study where we collected perspectives from more than 3,500 middle and high schoolers across the United States, all about their experiences about technology, the positives, what they love, and the pain points. And we actually analyzed all of those data alongside teens. And we wrote this book to share the stories that teens most told us they wished adults understood. The things that they said, these are the struggles we're having that we feel like adults don't always get. And we wish you would tell them. We wish our parents and our teachers understood these stories. And the book, frankly, is filled with the stories that stopped Carrie and I in our tracks and made us rethink our own assumptions about teens and screens.
Thanks for giving the top level. I'm going to jump in and share a little bit more and say that one of the things that Emily hinted at that was so tremendously powerful about this research and this work that we did together was that we had young people working side by side with us every step of the way. And that was like a point of departure for us in our research. Emily and I have been studying teens and screens, like she said, for a really long time. But we had never involved adolescents on our research team. The other thing we did to really lean into youth's perspectives is we recruited a youth advisory council. And so we gathered young people from across the US, and we had Zoom focus group sessions. And this was during the period of the pandemic when a lot of teens were still doing remote schooling. They were at home. And so we actually got a lot more insight into their particular pain points during social distancing and how COVID was impacting the way they felt about screens. But the key to that partnership was that, we had all this survey data that we had collected over 3,500 teens. Yet, Emily and I remember what it was like to have been adolescents, but we're not teens now. And so it was really powerful to partner with young people and have them really vet our interpretations of the data, and really not just vet our interpretations, but really help us identify the stories and perspectives that adults most need to hear. So that question that Emily made reference to, like, what is it that adults really need to understand? What do you wish adults most understood about sexting pressures, or about the digital footprint, or about activism pressures, and all the different topics we explore in our book? Their insights just crystallize so much of what adults are missing. And I'll leave it at that for now, because I think we're going to pull back the curtain and share
Fascinating.
some stories. Yeah.
And
Yes.
Merv, we should say also, Carrie and I are both moms. And so we have a vested personal interest in this topic too. And as we were writing this book, we parented kids from 0 to 17. So we had like the whole spectrum of human development in our households behind our screens as we were typing away and trying to make sense of this data.
Meanwhile, I'm in this conversation because I'm like, I've got a 9 and 11-year-old. So I'm really in it for me, but I'm really interested in having this opportunity to get in conversation so that the folks that are joining with us today can get a little bit more of this insight. So fascinating. I love working with students, and that it wasn't just about leveraging youth voice to inform your book. It was actually having youth voice frame, shape, and actually build a direction, and understanding what's happening behind their screens. And I love the tail end of just the today's main topic at the end is like, what are adults missing? And so high level, what are we missing? What are adults missing in this kind of world? And then we'll start to dive deeper from there. But maybe Carrie, we could have you start. What are adults missing?
Okay. Yeah, I'll jump in here. So, well, first of all, I'll say adults are missing so much. I think I've already hinted at that. We actually open the book. The very first page of the book is a picture, and it's an optical illusion by an artist, and it's a double image. So at first glance, you see one thing, but then if you shift your perspective a little bit, you see a whole other set of layers of things. And so we start with that double image to really underscore that when it comes to teens and technologies, there's so much more to the story than is apparent to the adult eyes. So we're going to tell a couple of stories that we tell in the book, but we'll do them in shorter form here. So in the book, in the introduction, I share a story about a work trip that I made to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and my colleagues and I were there to explore a potential project. And we were in a mall. We had gone out for dinner, and we were in a mall after hours, and we were sort of observing the social scene. And we noticed two groups of teens. And so one was a group of boys, and they were clustered in one area, and about 20 feet away was a group of girls. And the girls were in headscarves and abayas, so neck to floor robes, mandatory dress code in Saudi Arabia for girls, especially in public. And also mandatory was that distance between the two groups. They were, the boys and girls are not permitted to mingle with one another in public spaces. All the teens and their sex segregated groups had phones in hand, and they were scrolling, and they were chatting with their same-sex peers, and they were occasionally looking across the way at others, maybe with a flirtatious glance, and they all seemed to be following the rules of decorum. But later, I was reflecting with some young Saudi educators about, kind of witnessing the scene at the mall. And they filled us in on a hidden dynamic. When teens in Saudi Arabia appear to be just interacting in same-sex groups in public, they're often actually connecting digitally under the radar with the peers across the way. So they use Bluetooth to establish connections to one another, and then they're messaging. They may even be sharing uncovered selfies with no headscarves, and really building romantic relationships with, building romantic relationships that they, hope to pursue later. So that's just an illustration of the principle that there's so much more than meets the adult eye. Emily, why don't you share another perspective on this?
I will. And I'll just say, Carrie, I love that story because I think so many of us would have this experience of sitting and watching that mall scene play out and think to ourselves like, oh my gosh, teens everywhere are just so glued to their phones that they're not even paying attention to the people in front of them. They don't even care about the people that they're with. And it's so easy for us as adults to have assumptions like that. And Carrie, I think your natural curiosity and frankly, your like social scientist training puts you in the mindset of curiosity. And so you ask that question, like, what's going on here? And then you found out that actually the screen was not part of disconnecting them from the people they were with, but completely the opposite. And this book is really about challenging some of those initial gut reactions we have so that we can see what else might be going on. I tell a story in the intro about sitting many miles away from Riyadh in Texas, next to a colleague who was letting me look on while he was scrolling through his Instagram account. And we call him Ben in the story. Ben was 30 at the time, and he was looking at his Instagram. And we did I was doing with Ben a version of sort of simulation that we use all the time in our research, which is we ask someone to open their social media account and to just narrate aloud their reactions. Like, what are you seeing on your screen and what are you thinking? And this is actually so interesting because I'm sitting right next to Ben and I can see what's on his screen, just like I can with our interviewees. And yet, as soon as someone starts sharing their own reactions, you see what's on their screen in a completely different way. So in this case, if I had just been at a distance, like using a monitoring app and looking at his Instagram, I probably would have noted that he had a bunch of poetry on there. He's a poet. And he also was following some celebrities and influencers. And then there was just a ton of peer content, like social content from people who looked around his age. And if you had asked me to guess, how does this content make Ben feel? I probably would have said like, probably pretty neutral. Like I don't see anything super noteworthy in any direction. But because I was sitting next to Ben and he was narrating his reaction aloud, I had this realization Ben had when he turned to face me at the end of browsing his feed. And he said, oh my gosh, like all of the peer pictures that I'm seeing are my exes and their friends. And oh my gosh, my browsing, like my casual Instagram browsing is offering up this steady stream of reminders of all of my failed romances. And so he was having a completely different experience. And we talk about in the intro to this book, how part of what we're trying to do is not just know what teens are seeing on their screens, but to see it as they do, and to see this whole concept of life in a digital world through their eyes and through their perspectives, so that we understand more about how they feel as a result of it and how it's shaping their development in their lives.
Wow. Both stories, both equally fascinating. I would say, Carrie, the first story throws me back to, it would have been a different world. My middle school would have been a completely different experience at these parties, like whether it be a dance or in someone's house, where we were on completely separate sides of the garage or the dance hall. And we could have been engaging in conversation online probably a lot more directly than the last half hour when someone finally got the guts to ask someone to dance, which, at that point, you're back home already. And that social interaction was very condensed and lost. But I can see how, in that space, I mean, there was obviously a number of cultural things that they had to contend with, but they were still connecting. So interesting to hear that perspective. And then Emily, to hear your side from your colleague, I wonder for families out there that have gotten comfortable with being able to really be there as a supportive part of your kids' digital lives, what a great exercise to be able to get a sense like the things that we naturally scoff at, like, oh, and they realize they're scoffing too. They know this is wrong. How are they processing past these things? And it does add a very kind of different perspective. So thank you for sharing those stories. I think one of the other things, so that I often hear is this idea, like, you keep scrolling, and maybe we don't all get this realization of the kind of feed that we're getting, but we do keep scrolling. And so a lot of families, a lot of parents, they start to feel like, man, our young people, they are just addicted to their phones. They're always on it. It's hard for them to get off. As you were talking to teens, did you learn any kind of difference in their perspective around this idea that, yeah, our kids are so addicted to their phones? What do teens say about that? How do they feel about their use and why they're on it?
Yeah, the pull of the screen is so fascinating and like important for all of us to recognize. We all feel it. So we'll say a little bit more about that. But, listening to teens, asking teens about this pain point, about the pull to the screen, and listening to them talk about their digital habits was a really big eye opener for us. We have a lot of assumptions as adults about what's going on. And slowing down and listening to them was really revealing. So I remember listening to a teen who we call Bryn in our book, who really laid bare for us the gravity of the pull she felt to the screen, and specifically to TikTok. So she said, the app TikTok runs my life. I could sit there for hours on end just scrolling through it. I can't even count how many times I've fallen asleep on it. It has taken over my life. And so what's powerful about a 16-year-old telling us that is the sort of sheer honesty of it, the recognition that it's taken over my life, that it's gone out of bounds from Bryn's perspective. Now, we're at a unique vantage point because we're not her parents, we're researchers. So it's a lot easier to divulge these feelings of dependence to a researcher. And we can talk more about how, as parents, we can navigate that and try to get to more productive, open conversations about that sense of dependence. But that was really telling. Emily, you want to jump in and share?
Yeah, I'll share. It's no accident, obviously, that we all feel this pull to our screen. The design features have gotten much more attention in the news lately, but for sure, tech companies are really strategically using features like endless scroll, where we never reach the end of the news feed, or autoplay, so the next video starts right away. These kinds of moves actually they remove what would be our natural stopping cue that gives us a natural pause point to think like, okay, I have other things to do. I'm going to move on. They've taken away some of the friction, and it makes it so much easier to keep going. We also then add on to that things like notifications that activate this neural response and this curious impulse to check right away and find out what's going on. And most of us can probably relate to the fact that we are all vulnerable to these design pulls. But the simple reality is that teens' developmental sensitivities make it so that these pulls are really amplified for them. The ways that their brains are changing and developing make it so that that pull is even stronger for them than it is for us. And one of the things that really stopped us in our tracks was hearing from teens so consistently that when they weren't worried that admitting it would actually lead to someone taking away their device, they were so able to be critical of their own habits and to name the ways that they knew their screen habits were not serving them. And we recognize that actually when we know this, it's a super powerful pivot and jump off point, because it means that we can enter the conversation where we break free of this, like adults just telling teens, like, you're so addicted to your phone. And we ask questions about the kinds of relationships they want to have with their devices, the habits that they have that they feel like are not serving them. And then we can think about how to actually structure interventions, whether that's like an hour of screen-free time right after school when we're connecting, or device-free dinners, or whatever it is we want to do. We can think about actually pitching those things with more buy-in, because we can say, here are the things I hear you saying are important to you and that you want for yourself, and I want to help you get there. And I know that it's really hard because these design features are pulling us all in all the time.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, those design features, it pulls in adults just as much as our kids. So I'll say to our parents that are out there, I would say this all the time to parents, as much as we are concerned about maybe the screen time we have for our kids are watching us. And they're the first to call out the hypocrisy and be like, how about you, Dad? I see you scrolling Instagram or Facebook, throughout the day too. What about you, right? So I think it's important that we think about how these features it's a built-in, aspect of that experience. And sometimes it's very easy to get kind of lost in it all and not, understand or see the time that you're on there. One of the things I also tell families typically is, technology is playing such a major role with so many of the ways that we live life today, from entertainment to the way we learn to the way that we meet and learn from experts like you all right here on a Zoom call. But there are moments that we can really hold tight and say, you know what, for this hour, this is what we're going to hold sacred to put down, because now we're spending this kind of time together. Like there's a purpose and intention to be able to disconnect for a reason, whether it be family time, go for a walk, or do something, right? And kids want to be able to hear that. And one of the things you mentioned that really resonated with me, when I know that I can be honest and tell them how I'm feeling, and my consequence isn't going to be, oh, well, then take it away. But it's more so building that, that type of trust and relationship where it's helping to build your agency on the decision why you disconnect, how you disconnect, what are you doing? It's not just because I said so, but because there's real, opportunity there as a family or to do something else that you enjoy as well. So it's just kind of that prompt to get you there. So important. I think one of the other things that we're talking though about features, sometimes these features are designed to amplify things or to share things out quickly. And sometimes those share outs or those things that amplify can hurt others. And we know that one of the big questions we hear a lot from families, at Common Sense, but I'm sure you hear a lot working with families, is the question around what happens when my kid is bullied or harassed or hurt online. Cyberbullying is a question that is a concern we get all the time still. What are teens saying about the meanness and the way that it shows up in their worlds? Do they identify with, oh yeah, cyberbullying happens all the time? Or are there different ways that they see meanness and this experience in their worlds today?
Yeah, cyberbullying is obviously on a lot of adults' radars, and for good reason. Teens are really worried about it and they name those concerns to us. But one of the things that actually was really interesting to us was that when we started talking to teens about social conflict and the way that was playing out online, we heard that even though cyberbullying is part of the spectrum, that actually much of what they experience isn't in that category of what adults would think of as cyberbullying. It's much more ambiguous and subtle. And this is actually really important for adults to recognize, because we hear about things like teens talking about how they might go on an app like Venmo, an app where you could exchange money, and see an exchange between friends for movie tickets or for Dunkin' Donuts. And all of a sudden, this seems like totally benign content, but all of a sudden they realize, hey, I was the only one not invited to the movies, that all my friends are exchanging money for something that I wasn't part of. Or they go on Instagram and they see that someone uploaded a group picture that they're in, but they're the only one in the picture who's not tagged. Now that might seem like, okay, well, maybe it's just an oversight, and sometimes it is, but they're also sitting there puzzling, like, was this kind of was an oversight or an intentional slight? And this just goes on and on. We heard about finding out on Snap Map, seeing your friends' avatars clustered together on a Friday night and seeing that you're the one left out. And this idea of FOMO and finding out that you're left out through social media was something that really came up again and again. It was one of the hard emotions that kids and teens were talking about having to contend with. And I just want to say, because I think there's a natural instinct when we hear those stories to just say like, oh my gosh, well, I can save them from FOMO by just keeping them off of social media. But two things about that. One is that a lot of these tricky social dynamics are playing out also through things like group chats. We have a whole part of the book where we talk about these tricky dynamics of group chats and who's in and who's out of different chats and how that has real ramifications for offline relationships. So then you're like, okay, well, I'll just not give them a phone. I'll just give them no digital access. And Carrie and I were actually just in a conversation a couple of weeks ago with two teens who were reflecting on the fact that they were sort of late to the social media tech game relative to their peer groups. And they were talking about how before they had social media, they were in this constant position of actual, not just fear of missing out, but actually being left out, because so many inside jokes and social plans and so much relationship building was happening that they were not part of. And it reminded Carrie and I of this quote we heard from a teen that was like, if you don't have social media, it feels like you don't exist socially. So on the one hand, and then they both talked about how they got social media and they had to navigate all these feelings of FOMO and feeling left out on the other side, seeing all of this new social information all the time. So not to just say that this is a kind of like a rock and a hard place, like there's just FOMO from every direction. But I think that one of the things that teens really told us they wanted parents to understand and empathize with is the way that managing more feelings of being left out is actually just part of growing up in this world with a lot of technology, and is something that really requires our empathy and understanding and support. Carrie?
Yeah, I want to add another layer here because, Emily gives voice to the dynamics around meanness and around FOMO. But another thing that really was a revelation to us is that even when there's no social conflict happening, teens feel a lot of pressure around relational dynamics, around friendship, and how you play out your friendships, how you preserve your friendships, how you perform friendships for others. So we talk about this concept in the book called performing closeness. And this one story from 17-year-old Michelle really crystallizes how it can play out. She talked about a common dynamic that unfolds among her friends. So she was scrolling Instagram and she saw that one of her close friends posted a new selfie, and she double clicked to like it. And then within seconds, she saw the typing bubble indicating that her friend was typing her a message. And the message popped up and she said, "You liked my picture, but you didn't comment." And so Michelle said, "Well, I'm trying to think of something." And then the friend was like, immediately like, "Okay, but can you do it soon?" So Michelle like reflected to us and she's like, "And then I have to think of something, and it has like something quick, super fast, and it has to be really good." And we talk about this like felt pressure, and the pressure felt by the person posting the picture too, to post something that gets enough approval and validation that you know that it's worthy of being posted. And then the experience of Michelle of feeling this intense expectation around praising the picture, and really fretting because it's really a dilemma around authenticity. When so much of posting is an expectation and almost immediate, like rapid compliments become the norm, it can feel almost impossible to be authentic. And then on the other hand, when you're reading friends' comments on your posts, knowing what's authentic or not can be like, we say like reading the tea leaves. It's just like really hard to know. So that's another really interesting dynamic. I'll just name quickly a couple of others related to friendship that we see where tech plays a really challenging role. One is around response time and the meaning of response time. My friend sent me a text, and when it comes to how quickly you respond, it kind of depends on the relationship. You have to calibrate it around the relationship. So when it comes to best friends or really close friends, responding right away can feel like a necessity, just like the story of Michelle. When it's a more distant peer, there may be some forethought, some thinking about, well, the last time that I interacted with them, they took 15 minutes to respond. And we heard of teens actually setting a timer after receiving a text message in order to respond in the right amount of time given the relationship. Teens talked about second and third guessing the content of their messages, just so that they could get it pitched correctly, especially when they were talking with someone or flirting with someone and had romantic intentions. So there are all these layers of social information to think about, and ways in which one needs to be responding in order to convey the gravity of the relationship, one's desires for the friendship, and so on.
That sounds heavy for me. I'm just, in your discussions with them, did they share any kind of ideas or any ways that they're looking to try and process through these pressures? Because it's hard enough kind of navigating as a teen and young adult, let alone now also having to manage your replies almost as if you were working as a senior director of your marketing firm, which is you, right? Any
Totally.
insights just kind of from they were sharing, or starting
Yeah,
to try and
and
regulate
well,
some of that pressure?
Merv, I love that you drew the connection to like thinking about something we can relate to, because one of the things that actually Carrie and I found so helpful was thinking about connections to our own experiences. And we were like, okay, we can actually relate to the feeling, for example, of having a boss or a close colleague who expects like immediate email responses.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, like you feel like, "Ugh, I don't know if I can put my phone down. I feel a little guilty. I think I'm supposed to respond." And many of us probably handle that in different ways. But I think one of the things we know is that active direct communication can go a long way. So being able to say things to your colleague, like, just so you know, I don't check my email from 6 to 8 p.m. when I'm like doing bedtime with my kids, and I will get back to you after, or first thing in the morning or whatever. So just want you to know, like, you don't expect a response time from me during that period. That sounds so simple, but one of the things that's really effective and that we heard from teens really helps is when adults have conversations with teens about the pressures and these kind of communication norms, where we normalize that it's actually okay to feel really pulled to respond and to not want to be seen as rude and to be there for our friends. And we talk to them about how to communicate boundaries. Like, how do we kindly and firmly set boundaries that we need? And I'll just say we have actually created a tool with Common Sense called Feelings and Options. That's a thinking routine. It gets used alongside digital dilemmas. So the idea is we pair these scenarios. They're all based on real stories we heard from teens. We have these digital dilemma scenarios, and maybe someone can drop a link in the chat. There's a hub on Common Sense, totally free digital dilemma scenarios. And then we have this thinking routine, Feelings and Options, that actually walks you through doing the perspective taking step of identifying who's involved and what they're thinking and feeling, and then coming up with communication, like what could you say and how could you say it to actually do whatever kind of boundary setting is warranted in a situation. And we use this kind of approach for helping teens think through things like, how would I respond if I feel really left out? How would I deal with a friend who wants to chat when it's really late at night and I just can't give them support at midnight when I'm supposed to be sleeping and I have a test tomorrow and a sports game. And I think we found that powerful kind of combo of using realistic scenarios, so you don't have to just put it on them or wait for an issue to come up, but you kind of get to anticipate, like, what would you do if you were in this position? And then pairing it with actually not just saying like, here's high level what to do, but getting really specific about the language, because teens told us that actually being able to, like, knowing what to say to someone can be a barrier to actually setting the boundary and holding it, because it just feels hard in the moment.
So interesting. Carrie, you look like you had something to add to that.
No, I mean, I think Emily, what I was going to do, I put in the chat the link to the thinking routines, and I'm so glad Emily went there with Feelings and Options. That was designed for educators, but I think the principles that Emily just named around really normalizing, like naming out loud that we experience those boundary issues as well, and like, inviting our teens to think about, they're not going to use the same language we might use to set a boundary, but they can brainstorm things that might feel authentic to them, but also be kind and firm. Those are two words that Emily used, which I think are really important.
Yeah, that language is incredibly important. I think one of the other things you kind of mentioned earlier was this pull to bond. And I think one of the other things that I've seen a lot in conversations I've been having with teens, especially kind of older teens, young adult teens, Generation Z and kind of younger, is this pull to have to not just respond, but to show that you're a part of something. And there's the being performative and being like honest and thoughtful around things like engaging in kind of civic things online, politics, beliefs, perspectives, things that they believe in, but aren't necessarily sure how far forward they want to go because of, if they don't frame it right, like, could I be called out? So do we know, I imagine I read some of this, so I'm asking you, but I would love for the audience to hear. Are young people about being a little more political online, especially when so many feeds are populated by the algorithms to be in there, whether they're paid for or are connected to things you're interested in, and they start to kind of move in and shift in how they're being presented. But how is it impacting their kind of online lives? How do they feel about it? And what is
Yeah, so it's huge, Merv. And I mean, you named a couple of the layers. The algorithms are one piece, but then the social expectations are another. So let me provide a little context, because Emily and I have actually been studying the very question of how young people's civic participation intersects with social media for over a decade. So we have this longer range perspective on the dynamics that unfold and what teens and young adults have experienced. So about a decade ago, we did interviews with young people who at the time were civically active in school-based organizations or community organizations. And we wanted to understand to what extent and how social media were being used as part of their civic participation. Were they like expressing their stances on the causes of choice, their causes of choice online? Were they using social media to mobilize a larger public to take part in a rally or to support a particular cause? And the answer was yes and yes. And they felt empowered by those opportunities. They also felt challenges, and so some of those challenges are not going to be surprising to us because they persist until today. Challenges like toxic discourse, like naming a stance on an issue and getting into an argument with someone, whether they be someone you know or someone you don't. So that kind of sort of why am I losing my words? That toxic discourse that unfolds online. So that piece was a reality, but also teens worried about leaving behind a digital footprint that was politicized in some way, that a future employer could look back and find online evidence that they went one way or another on a particular cause because of the things they were doing. So these were real challenges that sort of in many ways cut against some of those great opportunities that they also recognized. Back then, if the challenges felt too weighty, the teens and young adults who we spoke with told us that they felt like they could step back from the social media mic, so to speak. So they felt like it was optional and extra credit for their civic participation. Fast forward to our most recent round of research today, and we heard a real profound shift. So teens in our most recent study told us that being political online often feels like the furthest thing from optional, especially when really urgent, high stakes civic issues are unfolding. It can feel expected and essential. And this is true not just for teens who are interested in civic issues, but teens who aren't even civically inclined. We heard this sort of broad resonance with the idea that you kind of have to step up and share your views on social media. And yet there's another real stumbling block. There are so many ways to get it wrong. And so we heard so many different stories about how these dynamics unfold, teens monitoring their peers to see who speaks up and who doesn't about timely issues, breaking friendships over the presence or absence of social media posts about timely issues. Even the timing of posts and their content can be controversial. So we heard about a story about a scandal that broke out in one teen's high school based on a beach selfie that on any other day would have gotten a steady stream of likes and over-the-top compliments and comments, but it was the day after George Floyd was murdered. So the comment thread blew up in the feed of this Instagram post about the inappropriateness, about the insensitivity of posting a beach selfie when this really urgent crisis was unfolding, across our country, and this wave of protest was happening. So there's this sense that where, when, and how teens engage on social media in civic ways is really under the microscope.
So really, thank you for that, Carrie. That's really interesting. And we will continue to see it. I mean, I think our young people are the most civically engaged out of all voting adults, and even like just ages out there right now. The research shows it. So they're actively engaging. They're actively using media and technology to share voice, perspective, and stance, and what they do from that point on. That's how things translate then into the real world. But one of the things you also mentioned there is just kind of recognizing kind of some of this. When, where, and how. And I'm going to bring up another topic that I'm sure there are questions from the audience from, and one of the ones that I have to kind of address a lot too in just some of our work. But I want to do it through the context of this book has a lot of new vocabulary. And one of the new vocabulary that stuck out to me has to do around the topic of sexting. So when I say when, where, and how, when we were talking just initially before around kind of like the politics and the civic engagement side of things, there's also some nuance around the when, where, and how, or if or not around sexting. And the vocabulary that popped out to me was watermarking nudes. And so I'd love for you to address kind of how young people are thinking about what does sexting mean to them? What are their perspectives based on your conversations? But in particular, if you can build in some of the background behind that particular vocabulary around what does that mean, watermarking news, and how does that relate to this conversation? That would be incredibly helpful for those that are out there kind of listening in and even reading the book.
Okay, well, maybe we'll just start by saying sexting. We know this is like a topic, maybe you just gripped the side of your seats. Carrie and I are both moms of daughters, so we feel like a particular set of, I think, pain points around engaging with the research around this, but we also found that engaging with the research around this and with young people's voices was super important for us. One of the things that we saw very clearly, and I'll just say in the book, we have a list of 9 reasons why teens told us they sexted, even when they know the risks. And that idea of trying to understand the calculus of their decision-making was something that we became completely obsessed with, because again and again, we were hearing that knowing the risks was not curbing the behavior. And we got really interested in why that was. And I'll say there's not just one simple answer, but a couple of the things that we heard from teens that were really important. We heard that sexting, adults are using this one word, sexting, to talk about behaviors that actually teens say fall across a pretty wide spectrum again. We used that term of like a spectrum earlier, but on the one hand, on the one side, there's like totally consensual and wanted sexting that's happening maybe between people who are already in an offline intimate relationship, and it's an extension of that. There's sexting that's pressured, where someone is feeling like, I don't want to do this, but I don't know how to turn down this request. And what they need in that moment, especially, is direct guidance on language and strategies they can use, again, to set the boundary, to say no. It seems so obvious, like, well, adults might say like, well, just say no, but we heard again and again from teens that it can feel so complicated, especially when requests are coming from people who they might really like and they might really want to convey interest and intimacy with. And then there's sexting that is completely non-consensual, sex that get forwarded without permission or coerced. If a teen has sent a kind of sexy picture in the past and the person is threatening to share those photos with others if they don't send more and more risky pictures. And so we heard about teens contending with this whole landscape. We also heard very clearly that there is a lot of pressure around sexting from all sides. Pressure, we heard about boys talking about pressure, and I don't want to make this just a boys and girls situation, but I will say gender really matters in a lot of the sexting dynamics and stories. And we heard from boys who described feeling pressure to ask for nudes, even if they knew it was not a good idea, because they thought it was something cool guys were doing, and maybe I need to collect them or at least have them from my girlfriend if I have a girlfriend. From girls feeling like they just had no good choices when they were getting asked. And Merv, you asked about watermarking nudes. We talk in the book about these different strategies that started coming up around the ways that people were navigating requests for nudes and trying to kind of manage this landscape. And one of the examples we heard was adding a barely visible watermark to your nude or sexy picture that has the name of the person you're sending it to. And so it's barely visible. So maybe they don't even know it's there. And maybe you're thinking like, what the heck? Why is someone watermarking their nude picture? And what we heard is that watermarking your picture is one way to make sure that you know if that picture ever gets leaked, that that person is going to be implicated. You can just zoom in and say like, this is exactly who leaked my picture. This is who violated consent. This is who, like, this person is involved in this. And we talk about this idea that just like when people feel like there are no good choices, they come up with these really weird strategies and solutions to try and regain some control. And we saw that playing out. I feel like I need to just say one more thing here, which is if you are sitting here thinking like, I don't need to talk to my kids about sexting. My kids are definitely not sexting. I just was in a conversation with a mom who said like, I know my teen, like we're very close. She's not involved in sexting. No need for a conversation here. And I was then talking to the daughter and she was like, well, I mean, yeah, I don't send sexts like of myself, but of course, like I have a lot of nudes on my phone because my friends who are sexting send them to me to like get my approval and to make sure that it's a good picture. And she said, and
I have heard the same thing.
Yeah. And she was like, I've actually gotten in some really sticky situations. Like I was showing someone else, like one of my guy friends pictures on my phone recently, and all of a sudden he was scrolling back and I was like, oh my gosh, I have these nudes on my phone of my friend. And I said to her, it is so important. And we were in a conversation with the mom who was sitting there like, but we were like, it is so important to be talking to teens. This is part of the broader landscape. And there are so many things we need to convey. Like if you ever receive someone else's nude, do not send it on to anyone else. Delete it. That is not something you want on your phone. This is a huge issue. That should be just like the bare minimum. We all need to have that conversation. Girls begged us to say to parents of teen boys, like, please tell your sons not to ask us for nudes. So that was kind of long, but that's just a little bit of what we talk about when it comes to sexting. Merv, what did I miss? Carrie, what did I miss?
Oh, I mean, Emily, you covered that really well. And I'll just name that that in the chat, the article in the Washington Post has been included there, which has some additional points of advice and insights on this topic. And of course, there's the full chapter is in our book, including really powerful quotes from teens about what they want. Emily gave voice to some of them, but what they really want adults to understand about sexting pressures.
No, I really appreciate, I mean, that's a sticky one. It's a hard one, especially because we don't want to tell teens that your feelings of wanting to feel connected to someone who, you have intimacy or emotion toward, right, should be disregarded. But how do we have, and when do we know what is the appropriate type of intimacy, and recognizing the pressure and not demonizing them for having the pressure, and being able to have that honest conversation of what healthy relationships can look like, should look like, and not that just because that was asked, all of a sudden it's an unhealthy one. Let's talk about where that ask might. And like you mentioned, I'm glad you mentioned, because I've heard this from young men myself, they feel the pressure to have to engage in that because everyone else has done it, or from what they feel like everyone else has done, and they don't even want to do that, right? So being able to have those kinds of conversations and just because you have them doesn't mean you're providing instruction. You're providing language, you're providing strength and opportunity to bridge a real connection in that conversation to something that could typically be very almost sticky. And for a young teen, I don't know if I'm ready to have that kind of conversation with my mom or my dad. How are they going to react? They're going to take it away again. And to know that that's not what's going to happen. It's really, this is the opportunity to have an authentic conversation around it. And how do you feel about it? What do you think you should do? Right? I am very, very like the whole definition around watermarking is telling me what that was. Just the ingenuity of like, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to track it. I mean, not to say that it's right. It could be right for the right person, but in that moment, we're saying, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to make sure that I can hold accountable this person who says they're there for me and trust me. I just found it fascinating. I know that we've got a number of questions that are piling up also on the back end, so I know we're going to get to them, but for the sake of trying to bring in, again, new language for folks, new vocabulary. Another one that I saw there was this idea of, you mentioned earlier, kind of reading the tea leaves, what are tea accounts? What are tea accounts?
Well, so some of you might have heard the expression like spilling the tea or sharing the gossip. And tea accounts are often set up, we heard them playing out often as Instagram accounts that were set up for this purpose of anonymously spilling the tea and sharing gossip in your community. And one of the things that actually was really complicated about the tea accounts that we were hearing is that there was this sort of confluence of completely malicious gossip shared just to slander people or hurt their reputations, and messages that had really good aims of like raising awareness about things that were going on in a community that were really hard and that people didn't feel like they could speak up about without anonymity. What's often the case is we saw that these accounts tend to be anonymous. So it's not necessarily clear who runs them, and they have some kind of form or submission set up so that people are sending in the tea, and then it's getting reposted anonymously. We saw that these can raise real complications for schools. One of the things is that they might be named something like, let's say your school is like Mill High School, like Mill High School Tea. And so everyone who's in the community knows like this is about our community and can find it. And we talk about how there's this confluence of like this geospecificity, this idea that you're speaking to a small community, and anonymity, which is a really important part of contributing to what's going on here. And so tea accounts raising a lot of puzzles for teens. And then we heard one of the things is that you might feel like you have to pay attention to what's on the tea account just out of anxiety of knowing if your name is mentioned. And so you end up with this whole wrapped audience of people who might be like, this is not a good idea. I don't want to participate, but I feel like I have to stay engaged.
Oh, fascinating. And there's yet still so much more in this book to read through. And I could keep asking questions, but I know we've got some great questions that came in. So I'm going to hand it over to our friend Lonnie. Lonnie, what is happening in the chat world? What are the questions we got?
Several great questions, and I think I'll give one category because it also was a category that came in pretty often on the registration form. And I'm going to try to power through. We have 6 minutes. I'm going to try to get through a couple of these. One big topic is essentially parents or the adults who registered are asking, can you give them some advice about the advisability, and if so, what kind of restrictions, restricting access, time limits? In other words, perhaps the understandable need of the adult to control what's happening on the phone, because it can be quite distressing to watch your kid on a phone for a long time. Do you have any quick pieces of advice, things that people can take as a takeaway to maybe try with their kids?
Okay, well, one thing that Carrie and I like to talk about is this idea of sort of gradual release, and just recognizing that developmentally younger kids and tweens and younger teens need much more support and intervention. They will have a harder time doing the self-regulation, but they're also more vulnerable to some of the negative sides. And so they will need much more of our guidance and involvement. And actually, one of the great things about that is that it's totally natural with our younger kids to be more involved and to help them and to say things like, hey, just so you know, your friend's parents might be reading their text messages. And so I am going to be reading yours to help you remember that this stuff is not private and that it's really hard. And then you're in this position of helping them make sense and guide them. Of course, what is appropriate for a younger kid is not appropriate as a teen gets older and they have more independence, and they really need developmentally more privacy. And we found that with older teens, when parents are still doing too much monitoring and involvement, often what happens is it drives their behavior underground and they start totally hiding it. They end up with duplicate accounts that they're like using in other ways or creative ways to go around rules. And that can really backfire, because then there's this extra barrier to going to their parents for help, because they have to admit first that they've been hiding all this behavior. So one of the things we think about is just how to open the lines of communication, more involvement with younger tweens, and then really thinking about just reassessing as they get older, as you feel and demonstrate more trust, and then moving toward that gradual release.
Okay,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Carrie. Go ahead.
I was just going to add one asterisk to that is beyond age, just also knowing their areas of vulnerability, because it may be some teens as they age are at risk, and so they need a lot more parental intervention and monitoring.
Thanks, I
So age
appreciate
isn't
that.
the only vector.
I want to remind folks, we're doing after hours. All three of these great individuals are going to be at after hours. It's a Zoom meeting, not a webinar. You're on screen. You can ask your own questions. They're going to be there for almost 55 minutes to answer questions. Buy a copy of the book, come to after hours. So if you feel like, I didn't get my question answered, great opportunity. One question that came in that I think is kind of plays on this. Excuse me, sorry. Mike was asking, he asked for the top 3 concerns that teens shared with you about digital life and involvement, but I don't think we have time for 3. Can maybe you, Carrie and Emily, can you each give us like, what was the thing that most stood out for you, the teens themselves, not what parents are worried about, what are teens themselves most worried about?
Okay, so I'll jump in and name one. So we talked about friendship expectations, but we didn't get into this really troubling challenge, and that is, there's an adolescent mental health crisis underway right now. And what that means is that even if a teen themselves is not struggling personally, they're more likely than ever to have someone in their network, maybe even a close friend who is. And so the sense that teens need to be available for friends who are struggling with a mental health crisis is huge. And we heard stories from teens. We heard this as a big pain point, feeling like they can't step away from their phone because they need to be there to save their friends from harming themselves or worse. And that was a direct quote from a teen.
Appreciate
Another
that.
one
Emily.
that we didn't talk about, and maybe I'll just tee this one up and then we can talk about it more in after hours, is toxic social comparison and getting pulled into what we call like comparison quicksand, and then feeling like you're just trying to figure out your way out. We know from the research that that kind of toxic comparison is a key mechanism that helps us understand like when screen time makes us feel really bad and is associated with like issues for well-being. And so we really want to pay attention to when it's coming up for teens. And it's something that, even though that's not exactly the term they use, they bring up again and again and again as a big concern.
Thanks. So then, Merv, I think I'm going to pitch this one to you, though. I know any of the 3 of you could answer, but because you're with Common Sense Media and Common Sense Education in particular, what are schools doing, if anything, in teaching sex ed? Any trends, including sexting and rules of the road in these courses?
Yeah, well, I will say there are a lot of schools that have actually built in, as they look at their sex ed curriculum, are starting to bring in these conversations around relationships and addressing when we talk about digital citizenship and the way that we the way that we interact online, the skills, but then also understanding how interacting online makes us feel. These are opportunities to be able to build in those types of conversations and really not just limit it to when you talk about sex ed, but really looking at, as we talk about relationships, friend relationships, romantic relationships, any of these relationships, what are the things that we need to consider in the way that we're acting, the way that we're requesting, the way that we are connecting with others, and how do we make that a consistent facet of the way we think about interactions in person as well as online? Now, obviously, as these conversations start to get a little bit more in that interpersonal relationship, we want to think about the impact of what does that potentially mean, being that now we're taking something from the physical into the digital, which does have the ramifications of the broader scale and the shareability and the pervasiveness of this type of content. So it is something we're hearing more and more and seeing being built in to these types of educations. But more and more, if you want to see real valuable change and expectation, how do we make it a consistent part and not just limit it to that one time you have it with that one teacher in that one classroom?
Whew. So much great advice.